All right, good evening, Nick. How you doing?
I'm very
What's
well,
been going
buddy. I'm
on
very
in your
well. Yeah, I'm good. You know what? I've been in a
how's
car for the
your day been?
last.
Bank holiday Monday. Oh, sorry. Bank holiday Monday today. So what have you been up to today?
Well, I've actually it's been a good day. We started the day at a National Trust Centre, looking at houses, looking at lovely gardens, being outdoors. But last 5 hours, buddy, I've been sat in a car coming back from North Wales with the kids and four dogs, working on my laptop. Yeah, just got back literally 15 minutes ago, straight upstairs, power up my laptop, ready to meet yourself, put some positive energy back into my headspace, which has gone a little bit dull, having been staring at a moving laptop in a car for the last nearly 5 hours. But all good. How about yourself?
How have you? Well, I was gonna say, how have you inherited two extra dogs? I thought you had two dogs. Now you've got four.
There you go. There's a man that listens and notices stuff for sure. Yeah. So my parents have gone. Well, basically, if people listen to earlier episodes, my dad's been unwell and has
Right.
terminal cancer. So he's decided to go and take a cruise and go and live life and see what the world has to offer. So him and my mum have gone on a cruise around the Mediterranean and have left us with their two dogs, which alongside our two dogs has meant we got four dogs, which is very
Wow.
entertaining. So we've been going out. You know what's good? It encouraged us to get out of the house, take them for long walks, go into the woods, go into nature. It's been nice. The kids have enjoyed it. National Trust
No,
Centre
no.
today took them a nice woodland walk through fields and saw sheep and lambs and all that stuff. And then jumped in the car. I was with Lucy's parents, so today up in North Wales, Mold, and then yeah, drove back. Or Lucy did the driving. I was sort of working on my laptop next door,
Lucy,
and yeah,
Lucy
and then
always
she got
does the
out.
driving.
Yeah, she always does the driving. Always does the driving. Yeah, I'm very
She's
happy
driven
with
me
her.
around lots of times, lots of times. You fall asleep all the time. That's your tactic when we're on the. I remember that journey we were taking in. Where was it? Where were we? Was it
I
Albania? Where we
know
had to drive back.
Albania to Croatia. I think it was four
Yeah, we had to
borders,
drive back,
12 hours
and we
solid
had to
driving.
leave at 3 in the morning. And yeah, we almost lost someone's passport. I think Joe's passport or someone's passport in there somewhere. We couldn't find it, couldn't we, when we were crossing the border at one point? But it was me up front keeping Lucy awake while you guys all just slept in the back. I
It's a
do
good
seem to remember
example of
that.
thoughtfulness gone wrong because I decided not to tell. For those listening, my wife drives a support vehicle, and we organise these cycle trips, and we do cycle trip most years across Europe. This particular trip, we started in Split in Croatia, went through Bosnia, Montenegro. I think Slovenia was in there, ended up in Albania. And
Yeah.
I just usually I plan the trips in advance, tell my wife what driving we need to do, where we need to be, and so on. For this particular journey, we usually in previous tours gone by, we've done 10 different tours, 10 different years. We leave the van in the country that we finish in. However, on this particular occasion, the hire company wouldn't let us leave the van in Albania. Well,
Mm.
probably for obvious reasons at the time, but you know, it was a long way away and we had to drive it back. Well, I thought I was doing a good thing. I thought if I told my wife that she had to drive it back on the final day at 3 a.m., that it would ruin her whole trip. She wouldn't be able to enjoy herself. And that would be she would just be dreading this drive. So I decided to tell her the night before. So we'd done 4 days of nice holiday. Night before, by the way, Lucy, 3 a.m., you need to be in the car. We got four borders, 12 hours solid driving, about 1,000 miles to cover, whatever it was. Is that okay? Apparently, it would have been a lot better for me to have told her earlier, especially as I
I think
slept
so.
for the
I
entire
think
journey while she did the driving and you navigated, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
she was not happy. I seem to remember having to do that, but at least we got there, and we I think we made it with about half an hour to spare as well, which was great.
Good. I have a
But it was
very
a tough journey
understanding
anyway.
wife.
So
Yeah.
it's not surprising that she did the driving today either. But sounds good. So that was the weekend, yeah? You were up there for the weekend, were you? I
Yeah,
take
yeah, it
it.
was nice. Family, obviously Lucy's side, cousins, barbecues. Yeah, watching football, Spurs having a miraculous comeback from 3-0 down against Liverpool to then lose in the 94th minute and be very Spursy again. No, it's been a good weekend. What have you been up to?
I think I've been kind of low key, but I've managed to play with some of my nieces who came around yesterday, and they came around. We played a bit of basketball in the gym, and then I went round to my folks today who were looking after them yesterday, and we had some more fun and games today, which was really good. And it's quite funny because they come into my house and they know that they can't get like crisps and chocolates and things like that. So they're asking, let's make some green smoothies. And then my other niece was like, can you make that mushroom hot chocolate thing? So I make them like this weird mushroom cacao thing. And it's funny. And then actually today, what we were teaching them about, maybe this will tie into maybe what we're going to talk about, but I was teaching the girls, especially the older one who's 10 years old, breathing techniques. So actually both of them are really interested in the stuff I do. And so they've both taken a copy of my book each. Like one of the nieces has taken the big version and the other niece has taken the small version, and they're going through it with a pen and editing it and everything. It's great. And so we were talking about that a bit today. So we talked about breathing and just the vital part that plays when it comes to stress reduction and anxiety and relaxation. But I think what I thought we might chat about today, I know it was one of the topics that you wanted to talk about at some point, is this idea of trauma and what we understand by trauma. Because the reason I thought we'll talk about it today is I was chatting to a friend on, I think Friday maybe, and we were talking about something, and I don't remember exactly what it was. I believe it was the pandemic and COVID. And I was just saying how, I'm not sure how this came about. I think someone asked me for directions to some pub, and of all the pubs in London, I just happened to know where this pub was, and I never go to any pubs. But we were talking about maybe there's less people out and about, and I was talking about some of my family who are maybe more reluctant to go out than they were before, the older people in my family. And I was saying actually it is a form of trauma, because the thing is, a lot of the time when we think of the word trauma, we're thinking, I don't know, like big life-changing thing that happens, you lose your leg, or you get held up in some hostage situation or something like that. But actually what I thought we would talk about today is maybe the unexplored element of trauma, and what people don't really understand, as you've said it before, you call it the little t trauma versus the big T trauma, which is all the things that maybe we, in our discussion today, will decide that actually maybe are trauma, as opposed to the big stuff. So if that sounds like something we can delve into.
Yeah, well, you know what? It came out from listener feedback, always a good thing, right? And please keep it coming in. Some of the feedback's been really, really helpful for us forming, how this podcast is going to move forward, and taking on constructive feedback and positive feedback, and lots of that as well, including gifts that have come through, which have been wonderful, which has been really, really nice as well. But one listener just felt that, or asked me the question about if I'd suffered both little t and big T trauma in my life. And it was quite interesting because for those that are close to me will know that in the past I've suffered from the big T trauma, and PTSD in particular, a post-traumatic stress disorder. And I don't want to go into that right now, maybe a little bit too soon for those that just started joining the show. But it was interesting because when they asked me that question, I immediately came back and said, on the small trauma side of things, often we talk about trauma and how it impacts us. And often the way that trauma can impact us, you'll find it's evident in childhood. And we got into a bit of a discord on text message exchange. And we're talking about our childhoods. So I knew this individual as a child, in schools and things like that. And I said, you know what? I had a really wonderful childhood growing up. And I don't think there's any trauma in my life until this incident happened later on in life. And everyone suffers trauma in their lives at some point. We know that there's one certainty in life, and that's death. And that's often for many the big trauma that impacts them: a loss of a parent, a child, a sister, a sibling, whatever. And we know that's really traumatic. And there's a grieving process I think you've related to in previous episodes as well on some of the stages that involves. But we often don't think about the small traumas, the little t traumas. And I mean, to be fair, the listener put me on a little bit of a reflective, I don't know what's the word, rabbit hole search, really. I went into the rabbit hole. I haven't quite come out yet. But I was thinking I had a really good childhood, and it was amazing. And my parents listened to this show, so there's nothing there that's untoward to say I didn't have a fantastic childhood. I really, really did. It was amazing. But there were incidents when I look back that probably have manifested themselves over time and have changed and impacted the personality that I am today. And I probably haven't ever given them credence before this particular listener highlighted to me that, what are the small T traumas in my life? I'm aware of it. It's funny that they say that teachers often teach the things they most need to learn. So as a coach, I'm working with people that suffer different types of trauma all my life, and during the coaching things, but never actually really identified it in myself because I'm the teacher in that instance. So therefore, I'm not learning what I teach. I'm teaching what I most need to learn in that instance. And I think there's one particular, I don't mind bringing this one to life. So as an example.
Yeah, I was going to actually say, what is the example, so that, because some of the listeners might be still not 100% sure what we're talking about when we come to little t trauma. So yeah, it might be helpful actually so you've just been reflecting on this literally the last 2-3 weeks, right?
Literally last 2-3 weeks.
2-3 weeks ago, you didn't consider this as a thing, this little T trauma. So what have you reflected on the last couple of weeks as now you can give us an example, say, actually, maybe that was a traumatic experience that I can identify with now?
Well, I think there's no maybe in it for me. It's a definite. And I just never really reflected. And we talk about, in a coaching relationship, and obviously I coach clients, there's a lot of it's about reflection, gentle reflections, raising awareness. Awareness leads to insight. Insight leads to action. And it sometimes can explain that the actions that we take, both pre and post a coaching experience. And we know that you're much more experienced than me, but the prefrontal cortex is part of the brain that deals with our everyday stresses. It regulates our emotions. It regulates our responses to those emotions. So in the example that I wanted to give is when I was 17 years old, me and two of my closest friends in the world, we got set upon by guys we didn't even know in an underground car park in Salisbury, the city that I grew up in, who basically beat the absolute living crap out of us, for want of a better word. It left my friend with a broken eye socket. My other friend was knocked unconscious. We were saved actually by two passers-by that happened to be training to be in the military. We've got the army base nearby. We've got Boscombe Down, where a lot of them train, and Salisbury Plain. And luckily, they were walking by, and they kind of stopped these individuals when one of my friends was already unconscious. They were kicking him in the head on the floor and all sorts. Now, I came away from that incident relatively unscathed in the sense that I didn't have anything broken. But there was 8 of them at the time. I thought 7 or 8 of them. 3 of us, all of them were a lot older than us, completely unprovoked. We were just walking back to our car, and it was all caught on CCTV. And we decided to take them to court. And I'll cut the story short. We took them to court for GBH, and we ended up dropping the charges from GBH to ABH because we were in the middle of our A-level exams, and it was going to be a long-winded jury case, and we wanted to move on with our lives. And we got there were several of the individuals were found guilty from the evidence that was there, which was a win in that sense. But when you look back at how that impacted us, so one of my friends ended up literally moving to Tibet and studying meditation and mindfulness and completely changed the individual that was, the outgoing. Not saying that he isn't outgoing now, but outgoing in a different way, should I say? He had suffered from panic attacks for a long time. The other friend went a different way and got into substance misuse. Now, I didn't do either of those things. I always felt that I was unimpacted by it, and I was the one that got away lightly. But actually, if I ask anyone that knows me, they'll always say I'm very defensive. And when I look back at some of the things that I did at university, particularly my first year, how defensive I was to anyone that kind of came into my space, or if I ever felt threatened, the way that I would react, I'm almost shocked at how I react now looking back. Never with violence, and that's not my kind of style, but I would definitely get very, very defensive very, very quickly. And I think I've held on to that. I don't think I've let that trauma necessarily go. It's somewhere at the back of me. And I thought it started just, you analyze your own life. I think, God, for the last, 24 years, 25 years of my life, I've been holding on to that somewhere at the back of my mind. I've never really exercised that experience. I just always felt like the one that got away, because I wasn't the one that ended up with broken bones and didn't take the path of my other 2 friends. So I felt like I was almost the lucky one, but actually it doesn't mean it didn't impact. And then, of course, that leaves you on a bit of a path of other little traumas and how they've impacted you along the way. And it's important to stress that, traumas with a small t can be anything from being bullied at school, from repeated things that just create that stress response. But if we don't deal with it, how it manifests itself.
Yeah, this is maybe what I was going to ask you, because I think it's interesting that you label that as a small t trauma, because for other, and again, this is all about, it's all relative and nothing has meaning except for the meaning we give it sort of idea. But other people would consider that to be possibly a bigger trauma, right?
Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
Because when I think of little t traumas, I'm thinking even smaller than this being bullied at school business, because what I'm considering being a trauma, and this is where people might disagree, and I think I've heard, I think we both listened to Gabor Mate before, who's one of these experts in this field. But this was an idea I guess I first came across maybe probably about 10 years ago, and it's this idea that everything can lead to a little t trauma. So, for example, let's say you're 6 years old and your parents are late picking you up from school for whatever reason, there's traffic or something. That actually could be a little trauma event, because as children especially, we tend to create meaning behind everything that happens. So
Yeah.
that meaning that person may at 6 years old develop, and again, they're not going to even remember it the next day, or let alone 25, 30 years later, but somewhere they're creating the meaning, I don't matter, or I'm not as important as something else. Or even if you're having a conversation with your child in the car, and you pick up phone to answer the phone mid-conversation, they may take the meaning that actually means that they're not as important as whoever else is on the phone. And so all of these things are what I would consider to be little t traumas, where they're just constantly adding to, I guess, our overall traumatic experience. So when we talk about traumatic childhood, that's what I'm considering as being a little t trauma, as opposed to, I know some.
And I understand the contextual difference, because for
event.
sure what I went through would be a big T in many people's instances. I think for me, because I was the one that didn't didn't take such a different direction post accident, and didn't get as violently hurt as the other two in that same action, I guess I came away feeling lucky. So therefore, in my mind, I hadn't suffered any trauma whatsoever, which is why I kind of labeled it with the small t. In my mind, I felt like the lucky one that didn't get impacted. But actually, when we think about the actions I took, even immediately after that, so in the run up to going to the court, which took me 6 months to get to court, I continued to go out, because every time I went out, I would get attacked by someone I'd never met. My car got bashed up and all sorts, because they didn't want me to go to court. We were under witness protection. There was all these threats coming in. If you go to court against these guys, you're going to, this, that, and the other's going to happen. And I was getting attacked left, right, and center, chased through town and all sorts. It was really frightening. But the idea of being defensive was I wouldn't let anybody tell me what I could and couldn't do. So I continued to go out, even if I was going out on my own, almost to take a stance. Despite the threats around me, I didn't want anyone else to tell me how to live my life. And I've definitely held on to that. I think, I'm someone who, we're different in the way that we are as people, but I'm very, I want to make a decision. I want to go and do something. Like, there's no one that can tell me I can't do it. And actually, right on episode 1, I'd never even considered it, but I bet this plays a part. You mentioned when I did my Ironman recently, and I had a target of going under 10 hours, right? That was my target. The first coach I went to said, look, I can't take you on because I think it's an unrealistic goal based on your family, work commitments, and your age and everything else. But just hearing someone say I couldn't was like, well, that's absolutely, I'm going to make that happen and find a coach that will take me on. And I did achieve it. But I wonder if this all comes from, a manifestation of that. I don't know. Maybe I had this before. I don't know, because I don't remember far enough back. But it's funny how these things play and how they impact our personalities later on.
Yeah, it might be something that you have inherently, and I think actually we're probably more similar in that regard than you may have mentioned there, because I'm very much against people telling me what I can and can't do, which I think a lot of people are anyway. But I certainly remember being quite defiant. For example, even like, and I'm not sure I've told you the story of this. I'm not sure how relevant this is, but like the way I spell my name, right? Hari, as opposed to Harry. And it makes actually more sense to spell it the way I spell it, because it's actually short for the fuller name. However, at the time that I changed it, which I think about 5 years old, when I decided to check, because my name was originally spelled Harry on all my early school books and things.
I never knew that. Knew that. Okay, I'm learning.
Yeah, and so my name was always spelled, like, from my parents and on the books and the teachers, it was always Harry. And then one day I just decided, no, I don't want to be like every other Harry. Not that it was a particularly common name then anyway. And I decided to change it Hari. And I didn't actually know until years later that my full name, Hari Laos, is Harry Laos. I just decided to change it to Hari, and it made more sense to me that way. And then years later, I realized it made even more sense because it's actually the first half of the first 8 letters of my name. And so I just didn't like that idea of following the crowd. And I tend to be someone that doesn't like to do that, right? Everyone in my family was eating white bread. I was at 6 years old, 5 years old, deciding that I'm going to eat brown bread. And I just like to be a bit more defiant, I think, in certain ways, and not do the traditional way of doing things, I guess. But I guess going back to the trauma aspect, I feel like from what you're saying, that was actually pretty traumatic, right? We're talking about you actually are having life changes from it, because you're deliberately going out seeking this kind of, and I guess not conflict, but you don't want to be boxed down by this fear of being attacked or anything else. So you're going out of your way to go out by yourself if
What was
necessary.
then? I mean, not,
Yeah.
I'd like to think I'm past that bit now. I think it just left me on
Yeah.
down a bit of a process of self discovery, right? Which I think is really important. We do that. We take time to look inward. We're so keen to look outward. There's a quote, and I'll get this wrong. I can't remember who says it. I'll maybe look it up in a moment. But it says, people that look outward dream, people that look inward awaken. And that was really powerful. I can't remember who said it, if I've got that exactly right. But it does awakens things. We can all dream, and that's great. But when you awaken what's inside you, that's when real powerful things, I think, can happen when you look inside. And I think looking inward, even at those instances that happened when I was 17 or 18 years old, or actually I think I was maybe even younger than that at the time, they've been quite powerful. And there's other things as well along the way that I just kind of forgotten. You bury them. And we've suffered a miscarriage in my life here. And that would be a big T in many people's lives. And it wasn't in mine. I wasn't ready at the time. And I remember having that different feeling of wanting to be there for my wife from one angle, and on the other side going, actually, I wasn't ready for a child. But actually, I think it's called a miracle baby or butterfly baby. There's a name for it. But we then conceived Eva, my daughter, who's now nearly 14, during what would have been the term of the first child. And so obviously Eva wouldn't be able to exist had the first one miscarriage not happened. So for me, she is a miracle girl, and it gave me that time and space to be ready. And I've the most emotional I've ever been in my life was the day that Eva was born. Like if I could describe happiness and bottle it into one particular moment, that was the moment of my life, really. And yet, when we had the miscarriage, that's not how I felt. I didn't feel sadness, because at that point in my maturity, my life, I just wasn't ready. But that would still be a small T. And I know you're saying, actually, the small T's can be much, much, much smaller than that. It can be as much just being late for being picked up, or a name calling, or anything that can happen. It's how we take that on and how we respond to it.
I mean, this is why I think actually the small T's are somewhat more dangerous than the bigger T's, because the bigger T's you identify and you can figure out, okay, I got into a fight when I was 17, or we had a miscarriage, etc., etc. The small T's, I think, are the more troublesome ones in one regard, in that we don't often know that they exist. We don't
notice them.
Why I'm doing this at 45 is because of something that happened to me when I was 3 years old by, I don't know, going up to a group of kids who were playing, and then they just ignored me, and then suddenly I find it difficult to go and approach new groups of people. And it actually comes out when it was happened when I was 3 years old, and I took this meaning that people don't approach me, whereas in reality, who knows, right? 3 years old, they don't even play together anyway. But that becomes a traumatic experience. And and what I want to lead to actually is what happens to these little T's in our physical body, because I think a lot of people don't realize, and you may have a different opinion on this, and that's fine, is that those small traumas, all these, and I think we can recognize this more when it comes to stress, but those small traumas create a physical imprint, as it were, on the body in some way, shape, or form. And if you're listening to this and you're struggling to understand, like, if you just imagine times when you get really stressed and you're feeling really stressed, and that, so for me, I experience stress a lot in my neck and shoulder area. When I feel stress, I can feel that tightening up, specifically the right side of my neck. And if I felt like that day in, day out, I'm going to end up with quite a crook neck. Now, this is a physical manifestation of a psychological thing that's going on. The same thing happens with all these small traumas that happen, these big traumas, small traumas. They do have a physical component on us, and I don't think we're really aware of that. And it wasn't until I about 10 years ago did this thing called matrix re-imprinting, which we can talk about a little bit, because it's a modality to help with trauma, and it's quite an interesting one. And that was when I first, I guess, was illuminated to the idea that all of these small things, right, being left at the supermarket, being waiting to pick up at school, are considered traumas. Because before that, I was a bit like you, and I thought, well, and I've had some incidents happen to me in the past which have been actually one very similar to that. But I think I was about 15, and I was in the Scouts, and it was a silly thing actually at that time, where I was hiking with 3 of my mates, and we were 15 at the time, and we were practicing for this race called the Chiltern 20, which is a 20-mile race through the hiking grounds and stuff, and which actually we won it like 2 or 3 years in a row. But anyway, we were down some country lane somewhere, and this group of motorcyclists were riding past or something. Now, I think one of them, like, did something as he passed us. I don't know whether he gave us the finger or something like that, but he did something, I think, that warranted me to respond. So I gave him the finger and then turned around and proceeded to give him the finger while he could see it in the rearview mirror. And then what happened is he stopped his motorbike. He came riding back by himself. There's 4 of us, all 15, and he's there with his levers and his motorcycle helmet still on. And he smacks me clean across the face, and it knocks me across the street. But I remember thinking, hey, I stayed up, right? I didn't get knocked down. I had ringing in my ear for must have been about a week or 10 days after that, because it really got me on my left ear. And I don't think for me that was a traumatic experience per se. Like yours, you're not considering yours to be a traumatic experience, but I guess.
I mean, the fact we're recalling it means it does sit in there somewhere, right? It's a memory that stays in the brain.
But I think for me, it meant like be wary of how I act on people, right? Because you don't know how they're going to respond. It also meant to me, I felt like I was strong enough to take a hit, and also meant to me that you can't always rely on your mates, because also they're 15, they're scared themselves. You can't always rely on your mates to kind of, maybe actually, interestingly thinking about it now, maybe it meant that because I've been quite independent in terms of like I don't rely on a lot of people a lot of the time, and I don't. Which is not great in terms of delegation, other things. And maybe that was just another thing.
I mean, so you're doing now what I've been doing for the last 2 weeks. I go, well, maybe that's why. And maybe that's why. And the thing is, we don't do this enough, right? And if we have a coach, and if I'm coaching people, this is what it's about. It's about asking yourselves questions and then a gentle reflection, the reflecting, and where does that lead us to? It can lead us to some amazing things. You giving me that example or listening out loud. I want to get into the modality piece, because obviously we don't just want to talk about our traumas all the way through the show and not give people why we're going there, because there are things we can do and things that can help us along the way. But also, just talking about opening like we are now can lead to insight. So you you giving you that story has reminded me of something that I hadn't really considered. So I'm going to go back into the rabbit hole. But
go for it.
So this is a trauma that I haven't even suffered, but you're talking about the little things, and yet I have. So let me explain this to you. And this is absolutely true. And this is deep rooted for me. And bless my mum, I love her to bits. But my mum had a recurring dream when I was a child, and she had it every single year. And that recurring dream should I say, I think I was about 17 when this day in inverted commas supposed to have happened. But she used to dream, and from about the age of about 4 or 5 years old, that I drowned and died. Right. And as her son, this was a very traumatic dream for her. My mum was quite spiritual anyway, and she would, she's a big believer in certain signs and dreams. And she's, if you're that way inclined, these things are even more real. And she'd have this every single year. So if growing up anywhere near water, my mum was always a little bit petrified for me, because she'd had these dreams. Even though I've been younger than the age that I was in her dream, dreams can tell different stories and they have different meanings. So anyway, of course, growing up then, being sporty and doing the things that I do, I learned to swim quite quickly, and I like being out, and I'd go fishing and do different things. But then I decided I must have been 18. I must have been 18 in a dream, because I decided to go to university in Plymouth University, which was on Exmouth campus, right on the seafront. And my mum was petrified. You can't go there. Go anywhere, but not there. So there's me as a 17-year-old going off to university by the sea. She's convinced I'm going to drown. I'm like a year away from this dream coming true. So I always had to check in. Don't go and get drunk and run into the sea, which of course I did on many, many occasions.
How old were you in the dream? How old were you?
I think I was 18. I think I was 18 when I died. But I went to uni at 17 on an August birthday, and it was in that kind of, my first year was the year, in inverted commas, it should have happened. Of course, I got older and surpassed that. But because dreams tell us different things, it's created a fear in my mum when I'm near water, even now. And I've done some silly things. I've drank only a few years ago, drank a bottle of champagne and then swam out to a buoy that was way too far out. And then coming back, you think, oh, shouldn't have done that. I could cramp. I'm at my depth. Can anyone see me? You get these moments. But the reason I think I panic is because I've got my mum's voice that's been telling me every single year from the age that I can remember, 4 or 5 years old, of I'm going to drown in water. Which makes me petrified of the stuff. So I go and do these Ironman events, which are 3.8K swims in the sea. I train in open water. I do the whole thing scared out of my wits that this could be my time. And you might laugh, right? I'm laughing as I say it because it's so ridiculous. But somewhere imprinted in the back of my brain is this fear that if I am going to go early, that my mortality will be taken not by disease, not by an accident. It's going to be taken by me drowning somewhere, because that's what my mum dreamt for, a recurring every single year for the first 18 years of my life. And I think that's although I've never actually drowned, obviously, but there's a trauma there of her telling me that dream, and she's doing it to protect me. Of course she is, and because she worries. But it's made me change my actions in water. It's made me panic in water. It's made me be less confident. And it's funny how these things slowly but surely. So I think it's that the small T's can be cumulative. I think is where I wanted to go with it. It can be really small, but if they happen over and over again at different times, they can become much bigger. And by the way, I'm still pretty petrified of going into open water. I'll do it. I have to for training, but I hate it every time. Heart rate's like 180, and I'm going like no speed. I just want to get out as fast as I can.
To do triathlons and all sorts, so she must really love that, the fact you're going in the water all the time. But I mean, again, these small T's, or these might all be in between T's, to be honest, they do add up, and they do create this, I guess, could create an imbalance or a dis-ease in the body and in and of itself. And it's interesting that you say that your mum is a bit more spiritually inclined, because you tend to be in the conversations we've had. I think you've changed a little bit in the last few years, but I'm kind of more that way than I would say that you are in those conversations, purely based on what I've learned in the last 15 years or so. And so it's quite interesting that you're kind of the opposite to her. And I wonder if that's the influence that you had, maybe growing up and thinking, I don't want to be just because that person has been visualizing or thinking about this or dreaming about this. I don't want it to become that prophecy. So I'm turning myself against that sort of idea of thinking, because
which I do try and do, but it doesn't mean I'm not petrified when I do it. Just in case I'm.
Well, that's the thing. Is because we can say we don't believe it, but on some level the body, the body does. So it's not even the mind a lot of the time. When you say, oh, it's in the back of your mind, it's in your cells. All of these traumas result in your cells. And talking about the modalities, there are lots of different ways that we can get rid of traumas. And the one I was talking about, matrix re-imprinting, it's quite interesting. I think you've heard of EFT before, right? Tapping, emotional freedom technique. Have you heard of that one before?
Yes. Yeah. I'm not sure. Not heard of your matrix.
The reason I'm explaining EFT first, because it plays into matrix re-imprinting. So for those listening, the simplest way of explaining emotional freedom technique or tapping is, imagine acupuncture but without the needles. And what you're doing is you're strategically 7 to 10 times tapping on different parts of your body. And there are specific areas that you now tap on, like the top of the head and outside the eyebrow, and just where the eyebrow meets the nose, and where else? I think it's the top of the lip and bottom of the lip, and different places like that. But they're the same spots. It developed over time to realize that actually they're the spots that need to happen. And you do that whilst talking about your anxiety or your fear or your trauma. And before you go through that process, you grade it. So if I was to ask you, for example, okay, let's say, for example, that fight that you had when you were 17, if you're thinking back on that, for argument's sake, I know it's not like a 7 or an 8, it's probably a 1 or a 0. But let's say if it was a 7, then we would do some tapping exercises whilst talking about it, and then see how that feels. Or if you're feeling anxiety and it's a level 8, you do a bit of tapping, it might go down to like a 3 or 4 or whatever. So this has helped a lot of people. And I'm not an expert in it, although I have done some of the basic courses, 5-10 day courses in it. And to be honest, it's not that complicated, but it's always about the nuance of how you approach it with the client. But matrix re-imprinting takes it a little bit of a step further, and it introduces the concept of effectively tapping on your younger self. So what you do is you essentially go in your imagination, as it were, back to a traumatic experience. For example, let's say there was that traumatic experience that you had, and you came back from that fight or that altercation that you had, and you remember there was a time and you're in your bedroom and you were, I don't know, afraid or whatever it might be. You would go back to that time and see yourself there, and then guide yourself in your head. This is all in your head, through tapping on that person, or you as your 42-year-old self would tap on your 17-year-old self, and then help that 17-year-old self deal with that trauma then because what we're trying to do a lot of the time now is deal with the trauma as a 42-year-old or 45-year-old that happened to a 17-year-old. And actually, it's way more effective to deal on the 17-year-old itself, himself or herself. And so that's effectively what matrix reimprinting is. I haven't done a very good job in describing it to all those matrix reimprinter practitioners listening, but that's effectively it. And this can become a very powerful modality. And I've used it with clients before, and a combination of that and something called timeline therapy, where you take people through different times of their life through different lenses. So you would see that experience as an adult, because a lot of the time when you see something as a 7-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 5-year-old, you're seeing it through those eyes, and you create a meaning. Whereas, for example, you go back and let's say in your memory, your parents get divorced at 6 years old, and all you did was hear them fighting or something, and then you blame yourself, or they didn't love you, or this or the other. You go back and you see that experience as a 30-year-old or 40-year-old, and you see actually it had nothing to do with you, and they were arguing in the kitchen, and you were in the lounge, and it was nothing to do with you being naughty or not putting your toys away or whatever the thing might be, which then made you into like a tidiness freak or something. It had nothing to do with you, and you see it through those different eyes. And sometimes you can go through that journey a few times and see it differently. And I find that these are really, really powerful ways, right, that you can deal with these traumas as long as you're aware of them in the first place as a thing.
Which is a good thing to highlight as well, the awareness piece. I mean, I think one thing that's really important just to mention, that me and Harry are not, we're not trauma therapists here. So as a disclaimer, if you are suffering with any major traumas, you do need, I do recommend you seek professional help. But we have an understanding, and that's why we're really much focused on the small T's for today as well. But as you were saying, you mentioned something I thought was really interesting at the start of that, which was it's not just in your head, it's in your cells, it's in your whole being, how we hold it. And I talked earlier about the prefrontal cortex is where we become overwhelmed, we hold things in our emotions in our heads in that context, and we can have overwhelm, and if we can't sort of empty that a little bit and talk about it, then that overwhelm can turn into depression and anxiety, and we have difficulty managing stresses. And what you were talking about there is going back, and actually the way I would look at it is you're releasing some of that, we're letting some of that out, which is what we need to do, because we hold on to it. Now I release my stress or my trauma, whatever it is, through exercise predominantly. That's my way of trying to release the demons, talking out loud, talking to yourself. When we met in Thai Garden restaurant and spoke for 9 hours continuously until every single person at the restaurant had left, that was just you and me chatting. And it's amazing when you reflect, and I'm a big fan of reflections as well. When you look back at it and go, God, we covered a lot of ground, and we probably did cover areas that related to trauma because we talked about our lives, and just that talking can just release some of that. I don't know the word,
definitely
trauma from the cells.
I think that for me, and what I would ask you in a second is that although talking is good and it's great and it can help with those things, the challenge for me personally as well, as someone who's a bit more cerebral and in their head, is that you may not realize that's the thing that's bothering you. You may have no recollection of what it is that's bothering you. And so have you ever tried flotation tanks and sensory deprivation tanks?
No.
Are you familiar with what they are at all?
I'm familiar with what they are. I think for me actually, they've got some alternative therapy things here in Exmouth, probably enough all places, and there's a place that does something similar kind of things here that my wife's been saying you should give it a try. But yeah, so I haven't done it myself. No.
I would recommend it for you for a couple of different reasons, but for those of you that are not familiar with it who are listening, sensory deprivation or flotation tank is like, imagine a big bath with a lid over the top of it. So
you are in water right now, so I'll probably be immediately terrified because of my story.
This is actually a good point, actually, because what happens is you go in and the water is filled with magnesium salts or Epsom salts to a concentration that you would never get to by filling your own bath up with magnesium salts. It's roughly the same concentration as, is it the Dead Sea or the Red Sea? I can't remember which one it is, but the one where you basically just float on the top of the water. Yeah. And so you go in there and the water temperature is roughly, I think, 37 or around the same as your body
temperature.
Yeah, and the idea behind that, and you can have a light on, although normally I turn the light off, and they have some sounds for the first 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes, and you're in there for about 45 minutes or an hour, is that you're floating and you can't see anything. It's pitch black, and you can't tell where your skin ends and the cosmos begins, really, because everything's the same temperature and there's nothing for you to touch. And the first time I went to one of those things, I've done them maybe a dozen, 2 dozen times now, and I actually joined up after the first experience, because I had this experience where I was lying there, and you can have a little neck thing to support your neck, but you don't really need it. Your head will float anyway. But I got to the point where you're so relaxed, and the magnesium helps as a muscle relaxant anyway. And I remember at one point feeling and literally coughing out tension that I'd felt in my right hip. I know that that's where it came from. And I coughed it, and it's like there was a sting come out of my mouth. And suddenly I was like, and after that one, that was my kind of spiritual experience, if you like. And I was sold on it. So I signed up for like a 12-month program. And then I never got back to that same level, or a couple of times I have, but that I would suggest for you anyway, because from a purely muscular perspective, you do so much training, you've got like probably tight muscles, and if you want to recover really well, magnesium is the way
Yeah,
forward.
I'd agree on. I definitely can sell the benefits of magnesium for sleep as well, by the way.
Yeah, for sleep. I mean, so I would say, but I guess for the point we're talking about, the little T and the big T and all of this, is that especially if we're carrying tension, let's call it tension rather than trauma, but that trauma, all these little things that have created some level of tension in our body, and we don't really know that, maybe we could talk about it for 4 hours and suddenly we'll release it.
Yeah.
That could really work, especially if you don't know why you've got it or where it is. That would be one of the things that I would suggest. And also something that I've not tried massively, but I've done a lot of breath work techniques, but there are different breathing techniques: rebirthing, holotrophic breathing, transformational breath work, which go beyond the whole Wim Hof style. And I've been in sessions where we've been breathing for half an hour, we're lying on the floor, and people are literally in floods of tears, screams, moan, and they don't know why. But it's this trapped up trauma that is being released from the body in some way, shape, or form, and they may not even realize afterwards what it represented, but they just feel lighter, they feel freer.
It's interesting. I was going to reference, because a friend of mine posted an Instagram video this week. She races for an obstacle course racing team that I'm part of called Nuclear Phoenix, and she won't mind me saying, because she published this publicly, so hopefully there's nothing wrong with me sharing this. But she's just done a Everest Base Camp trip. She's a professor of sports science and lectures at university, and or doctor of sports science. And she did this Everest Base Camp experiment as part of her studies and things. And she just posted a video. She got to the Everest Base Camp. She'd been there once before, so it wasn't the first time. She sat down, and for no reason at all, I say in inverted commas, she just started bawling her eyes out. And someone filmed it. And she actually put the post up and said, "This came from nowhere. Don't know why. Just had to let it out. It was a release." And I cried for like 15 minutes and felt so much better, and everyone was supportive. And yes, someone did film it, but was caring and looking after her and documented as it happened. But as a release, it was really powerful just to watch a friend cry. But it wasn't a cry of where you wanted to, she kind of, you read the post and it tells you, I'm not looking for sympathy or anything like that. It was just a release. It was just something that came out of from what would have been quite a probably tough experience of getting to Everest Base Camp, and the trekking and the air, the oxygen, the lack of the digital detox, probably all those kind of things that kind of play in. But it's to watch someone else just cry, but cry in a way where they're not afraid of crying and they're doing it quite openly. I think it was quite a powerful, one of the most powerful Instagram videos I've seen when my friends post generally, and the support on that post kind of demonstrated that. I don't know if the flotation tank stuff sounds great. I'd be well up for that kind of thing, but it's not accessible for everybody. But I'd like to get your take.
No, but breathwork generally can be, because you have to be a bit careful with the breathwork stuff, because I know there's a lot of online stuff you can do where you may be on a live online retreat, as it were. But usually this kind of breathwork, you would require a sitter or in an environment that you can be in with other people rather than purely online. But it is probably more accessible than maybe the float tank for a lot of people. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that with the trauma, because again, people listening to this might be thinking, I haven't got trauma. We all have trauma. We all have trauma. And that could be the big stuff, like you've been talking about that. Well, you've been calling it little T stuff, but it could be the little T stuff or the big T stuff that you've been talking about, or it could be those really tiny things that you're just not even aware of. That here's the thing with what would be a little T, but it's not really, because it made an impression on me. I remember one time, and I don't know if my friends who are involved will be listening to this or not. I've shared this podcast with them. I don't know if they're the people to subscribe, but I won't mention their name. But two of my good friends at secondary school, and I remember I went around to my friend's house once, and I was probably 12 or 13 years old at the time, and they kept asking me these weird questions because I was had a girlfriend, okay, and we'd only dated a few weeks, I guess, but they were asking me these weird questions about if I liked her, and also the way that we got together was a bit of a ruse, like we were pretending to be boyfriend and girlfriend to make someone else jealous in some way. Then we ended up becoming boyfriend and girlfriend. Anyway, and then I was hearing something happening next door, and then the door opened and closed and left, and they were like, "Oh, it's just my sister. It's no one really." And then it transpired later that it was this girl was there, and I felt really kind of betrayed by my two best mates, why they were, I guess, colluding together. And I think that, these little things, again, as we talk about them, and I've thought about this before, but they all lead to, okay, maybe that's why you're not as trusting in this way, or maybe you're not dependent on other people in the same way, because you have all these little experiences that then lead you to believe that, and you might not put them all together.
Sure.
And so, yes, talking about it can help, but I think if they're even more subtle than that, and you don't know that you're holding on to these things, then these other modalities, I don't know if you've come across anything that can help you other than what we've talked about, like with the EFT and the breathing and the flotation tanks.
Yeah, there are some. This is going to sound terrible. You've just given me a traumatic story, and I'm just going to tell you what first came to my mind when you started saying it. And this, I'm going to apologize because it made me laugh. For any Alan Partridge fans out there, you might understand this. I'm going to lighten the mode a little bit. But you said, I had two school friends. You kind of gave a bit of detail away, and I won't give their names away, but I don't know if you ever remember the Alan Partridge sketch. But I was almost imagining you to say, I've got two friends. I won't give their surnames away, but I'm talking about Jose and Pedro from Little Shepton. But in order to save their identities, I won't tell you their surnames. I feel like you gave us everything there. They will definitely know who you're referring to.
They'll probably know who they are, because it happened. They you know what? Actually, they might not, because for them it might have just been a normal Tuesday, right? And
that's a good point. Yeah.
It won't register that I'm talking about those people. Maybe if they remember the whole situation, it will. But I think they're not. The point is that they maybe weren't doing this maliciously or to collude with each other. It was just kid stuff, right? And I think sorry, what you were going to say?
No, you crack on. Go on.
What I was going to say was that sometimes, and this came up when we were doing matrix re-imprinting and EFT, I think it was, is that, let's say this trauma is, you were 6 years old and your other 6-year-old friends made fun of you in some way. Now you're a 45-year-old man. Are you saying that if a 6-year-old right now came up to you and they started making fun of you, you'd actually be offended or take that to heart too much? Probably not. So why are you letting that happen now? Because every day you're letting that 6-year-old.
That's kind of where I was going to go. I think there's a point here where we've got to take some accountability for who we are now as well, not always let the past govern who we are now. We got some. So you mentioned Gabor Mate earlier, and a little bit here. We've got to. Well, I say we've got to, in my opinion, and this is, everyone's got to deal with it differently, but whether it's breath work, whether it's meditation, whether it's practicing mindfulness techniques, whether it's exercise for me and running, a lot of it is about letting go of the past and focusing on the present. We talked before about the breath work takes us immediately into the present. And if we don't, I don't know who said it, but I don't know if anyone said it, but I'm not sure, I've heard it out there somewhere. You can become a prisoner in your own mind if you don't let things go. Now, there's a Gabor Mate talks about in one of his books, a really major incident in his life where he hits his 3-year-old son for not singing happy birthday to him. Now, go and listen to the book or read it if we want to find out more about that particular story. But what he says there is, look, it's not that he's not ashamed of what happened at the time, but he no longer holds shame, regret, or guilt to that action, because he changed who he was after that action. And actually, the things that pull us back into the world of trauma and fills our minds and our cells and everything else in our mindset and all the things that happen to us, is when we don't let that stuff go. And the shame and the guilt can be absolutely paralyzing. And he doesn't look back now. It's not just paralyzing for him. He talks about his child. He co-wrote his last book with his son, who I think is now 39-ish. I think he's 39 years old. And his son doesn't want to be referred to all the time as being the boy that got slapped, as if it changed him. Because he's like, look, the dad I remember was an amazing dad. I don't remember that. And maybe he does. Maybe it's locked in there somewhere. But ultimately, he doesn't want his own life to be governed by an incident that happened when he was 3 years old either. So he talks about it quite openly and says, look, it's something that shouldn't have happened, but I have to let go of the guilt and the shame and the regret, because it did happen. I can't change it. It's happened. It's out there. I can't pull it back. What I can do is reflect and use the learnings to become a better human being for tomorrow and be present today. And I think that's really powerful. I think there's I can't change what happened to me when I was 16 or 17, but I can let some of that go. And I don't want that to hold me back to the person I want to be tomorrow. Yeah. There's a story. I like my Zen Buddhist stories, but there is one out there where I think there's a woman who comes to a Zen master with some trauma, and she talks to him about the incident she suffered, and he says, "Would you like a cup of tea?" And he pours the cup of tea, and as she's talking, he continues to pour till the cup starts overflowing, going everywhere. And she says to him, the tea is spilling everywhere. You need to stop pouring. And he said, well, your cup is already full of pain and trauma. I can't help you until you empty your cup. Similarly, I can't pour you any more tea until you empty the tea in front of you. It's kind of saying we've got to empty it first. And I think what you talked about there with the emptiness of the people just crying or yelling out in the breathwork exercise that you've been in part of, or whether it was you leaving the trauma in your muscle pain, we did the flotation tank. Or for me, I think talking is incredibly powerful. That's why I love coaching people, talking people through and hearing. When you say things out loud, they sound different to how they sound in your head. You can sometimes surprise yourself. You speak out loud and go, oh, I just said that. What that feels different to how I thought it would feel. And just emptying our cups. So whether that's emptying ourselves, emptying our minds, whatever technique it is we need, if we're holding on to the small t traumas, or go and navigate, see what they are, and then see if you can just let them go in whatever mindfulness or technique you want to deploy. But I do think it's important we don't hold or label it with the guilt and the shame that we often carry along with us. And I think if you look back, I'm going to label it back to my small t, there is some guilt there. And I had never realized it. The guilt for me was the one that got away. So my two friends got the broken bones and all of them changed their lives and took two very different focuses. And I was all right. And I think there's some guilt there. Why was I the one that was okay? Well, how was that fair? That's why it hasn't impacted me, because I didn't, I got punched and hit like you did with that individual, but ultimately it was bruises and it was the ego and the psychological battering, definitely, but I didn't appreciate it at the time. But there's definitely some guilt and shame that I didn't end up like they did, that I didn't go and, for example, one of my friends getting kicked in the head while he was unconscious by 5 guys. I was being chased by 2 of them. I could have run towards him, but I was running away from the other 2. There's little things you could have done differently. Yeah. Who knows how that would have turned out? But there's shame and there's guilt there that I need to let go. It was 25 years ago. No, it's not helpful for me now. But I just think it's, I don't know where I'm going with that really. But I think there's an emptying you need to do. I think that's why it can be helpful.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the old Frozen adage, right? Let it go. It's all about letting it go.
Yeah, there you go.
I think it's so much easier said than done, and we haven't talked about it now. But I was in another altercation with some people down in Bournemouth like 20 years ago now with my brother-in-law, and again there was I think three guys, similar to you, ended up in court and all sorts of things. He actually ended up hitting his head on the curb and having a brain aneurysm, and they tried to say that it could have happened at any time and it wasn't necessarily being smacked in the head and hitting the concrete. But as a result of that, now subsequently he has, we think that the fluid eventually went down his spine, and now he's got this spinal condition, which makes it very difficult for him to walk and have balance. And it's called arachnoiditis, which has got no cure to it. And this happened like 10 years ago, the spinal thing. So it happened like 10 years after the initial fight. And I feel guilt to some degree, and I'm doing my best to let that go. And he said, let it all go. And he doesn't actually remember what happened on the night of the fight, but I won't go into the details of it, but I feel somewhat responsible for the altercation in the first place. But at the end of the day, they're the ones that threw the punches and came at us. It wasn't the other way around.
Yeah.
We were just defending ourselves. So I guess I guess what I'm trying to say is it's a lot easier said than done, the idea of letting go. And I think, I don't know, I guess part of the journey maybe is to acknowledge that you're holding on to that in the first place, because you've got to acknowledge you've got a full cup in the first place in order to empty it. Yeah, so
just
I don't know.
On that point, something really interesting that came to mind. I've listened. I think it was Simon Ong. I think it's Simon Ong. I'm crediting the wrong person. Apologies. I think it's Simon Ong. He wrote a book called Energize, which I recommend. But it's a really good book.
Oh, I know him actually.
Yeah. So he says that it's impossible to be grateful and unhappy at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know why that hit me like wow, that's for me, that's really powerful, because you were talking about then you've got to be aware of your cup being full as well, and being aware of what we have, because we can get caught up in the unhappiness of the things that have gone on. For some people, that I understand, that's incredibly difficult for some majorly traumatic incidents that may have gone through. But also, so I did a podcast on my other show, the HR one, with an individual who was a survivor of the Children of God cult. Now, for those aren't familiar, Google it. This is pretty traumatic stuff. You know, we're talking about sexual abuse and mental abuse and physical abuse and all kind of things from a very young age. And yet, when I spoke to her, this individual on my interview, I haven't released it yet, so I won't disclose the name at this point, but it's due to come out. But she talks about how she actually wouldn't necessarily change anything because of the social connection she made during that time. They're the closest friends she could ever have, and had she not been through those experiences and that trauma, big T trauma stuff in my mind, she would never have had the friends that she has now in her life, and she would never swap those friends for anybody. She has to go through the yang or the yin, whatever way, which way around it is, to get to where she is now. And although she wouldn't wish that upon anybody else, that's her life. But she still right now views her, and she nearly did take her own life when she went through the hard part of that. She's come through the other side, and that's very much what we talk about. But it was really interesting when she said that she's very, very grateful. But when anyone else looking at me, how could you be grateful for the life that you've had? And she can now say that she's happy. You can't be grateful and unhappy at the same time. I just thought it was a really interesting thing. And there's a book, I haven't read it, but I've audio booked it, which is called Trauma and Recovery. So I'm not a trauma expert by any stretch. A really interesting book. It was by Dr. Judith Herman. And she said one of the things in that, and this is talking about big T stuff again here, is that people that suffered certainly big T trauma, they need to be empowered to take their own choices and decisions about their recovery. So you and I can't tell you to let it go. That isn't going to help. No. I'm not giving you. You've got to take the ownership of that choice of what you want to do, whether it's breath work, whether it's not, going back into being vulnerable, whatever. Someone else telling you to let it go isn't the answer. It's how we navigate that separately.
Yes. This is, I guess, a little bit controversial when I tell people this. It's about taking responsibility a lot of the time. Now, you could not necessarily responsibility for the thing that happened to you, but like you say, responsibility for your own recovery from it. And I say to people who are challenged with this, and it's a bit cliche again, but I say, if you're not responsible, then you can't be response-able, because if you put that onto something or someone else, you've got no power to make the change to the thing that happened to you. So even though you're not to blame, because blame might be a different situation, if you find that you can be responsible for it in some way, then you can be response-able and you can be able to move forward. It's like if a new CEO comes into a failing company, yes, they're not to blame for all the things that happened to that company. But if they stand there in front of the press and say, I take responsibility for where we are now and where we're going to go forward and how we're going to get through this, the stock price will probably be fine, right? If they start blaming everything on other people, then you've got no power to make the change yourself. So it is about taking responsibility for where you are, not necessarily you're to blame for what happened to you, but you can be responsible going forward for your recovery. But I just wanted to, as we were talking earlier, and maybe bring it to a slightly more tangible point for people in their everyday, in that what suddenly jumped at me is sometimes we have lots of conversations with people at work, and we're left with what I would call a little bit of a charge. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, there's something that's irritated us in what they've done, right? Maybe they've shown up to the meeting late or unprepared, or maybe they've taken credit for work that was really two of you working together. And we don't say anything, right? Because we don't want to ruffle feathers. We don't want to, we think it's not a big deal. But all of those small charges do build up over time. And what you were talking about before about talking, and that was in the context of us having our chats in that Thai garden, something else. But what do you see being working in HR, working in all those with people all the time, as your advice, I guess, to it's not conflict, because it's not conflict resolution. It's just that something is leaving a charge or an unsavory taste in your mouth in your interactions with people, which again we could call as little T's here, because these are, in the playground it's easy to say, oh, these people are bullying you, but when you're in your 30s and 40s and you go, well, they're not really bullying me, but they're just taking a bit of credit here.
Essentially, when you're 30 or 40, though, you realise that there's probably something going on in the bully's life that we're not aware of, that's probably traumatic in their own lives, right? We have the sense to understand now that often those that are bullies are going through something themselves. Not to make the bullying acceptable by any stretch, but we understand it more than we are at face value when we're just being confronted by a bully in front of us. So going back to where you were, I think we can incorporate everything you've mentioned. I mean, I'm a big believer in breathing 7 times before I'm going to make a really, if I feel like I need to react impulsively, that's something inside will tell I need to breathe 7 times here, because otherwise I'm going to react in a way that I'm not going to like, potentially, right? And I'm, and we have that fight, flight, or freeze. Sometimes I will go into fight mode and I'll come straight out that defensive bit I talked about right at the start of the show. Take 7 breaths, reflect, and then see if my reaction is the same. It very rarely is. And so I think that's something we can do to manage it. I think something really interesting, though, is when we are often triggered by the things that happen, someone being late, for example, we think it's rude. I'm using that as a really simple example. We're in an HR meeting and someone turns up late. We don't know what's actually happened in that individual's life to the reason why they are late. Maybe they've had traumatic news. Maybe there's been a major accident. Maybe they are just late as well, by the way. But we don't know. But we're so quick to react and to judge. And actually, I think sometimes we're wrong. It's like with road rage. Someone cuts you up and we get all angry. We don't know why they've done it. Or maybe they're rushing because their child's being into hospital and they weren't thinking. I don't know. But I do think there's a way that we can change the narrative in our minds to create a better narrative for ourselves, just to ease that stress. Because we create that stress in our body by our reaction to it. As you say, we're giving meaning to something, which you talk about a lot, right? We feel what we think. We feel what we think, and if we're pissed off by someone being late, then we're going to start feeling pissed off ourselves, and it's just not helpful. Yeah.
What you talk when you were talking about road rage there, it reminds me of a story, and I do write about this in the next book. But I was at this was years ago, 10, 15 years ago. I was at a set of traffic lights nearby, and I was going straight, and there were 3 lanes, I think there were. And I was in the lane that I should have been in, and I was driving, and this guy who was on my left, so I should have really gone in front of him if I'm on the right, was on my left and was like putting his foot down to get ahead. And he got really irritated with me and, did a bit of road rage through his window. And I immediately, I thought to myself, similar to what you say, right? I don't know what's going on, right? And I thought to myself, actually, I feel sorry for him that he's not able to manage his irritation or his impatience in another way, and he's able to do that. And so I just let it be, and I was like, so I didn't hold on to it. I let it go. However, and I don't normally take that route, so I hadn't taken that route again for now 4 years or something. And then I was taking that route again, and then what I realized is that the lane that I was in was a right turn only lane, not going straight. So he was actually right, because I was wrong in that I was going straight when I should have been turning right. And I thought, and then it suddenly made sense why he was getting irritated with me. And I thought to myself, I'm really glad that in that moment I didn't make a deal of it and try and react with him.
Stick your finger up and having him chase you down and punch you across the street.
Actually I was wrong. I was totally wrong.
Well, we've all done that, right? I mean, no one, I think everyone listening to this who could say there's some time in their life where they've reacted in a way and realized they were on the wrong. I think there's also a bit here where you can think about, look, sometimes we're unhappy with the way people react to us because of the way that we see the world. But actually, if you put yourself in the other person's shoes, with the upbringing they had, with the education they had, with the social and economic background they have, with all the little things that play into the personality that they have, it's only when you think about it in that context, you have to ask yourself, would I have reacted the same? And we can never really answer the question, because we have our, you and I were brought up differently, different households, different parts of the world, different parental views, different political views. All those things shape who we are in this moment. And sometimes we're quick to judge based on who we are. And actually, we've got to let that, for me, it's not always easy, by the way, and I'm by no means perfect, but we've got to try and leave that ego at the door. There's one thing that is true. I talked to my daughter about this literally last week. We are many things. Like we say, I am happy, I am angry, I am a footballer, I am a parent, I am a business person, I am an entrepreneur, I am an Iron Man, whatever. The only thing that's absolutely true in all of those statements all of the time is I am. Everything else is a label. Everything else we've labeled. I am, you can bring this into a traumatic context. I am a victim. I am unfortunate. I am, whatever. The only thing that's really, really true in there is the I am. And well-being is innate. If you think about it in that context. And I think that's why when Dr. Judith Herman in her book talks about giving people choices, not always, but in many traumatic incidents, we didn't have a choice in that situation. It happened to us, and we feel like it wasn't to us. So therefore, you don't want to be told anything. You want to have a choice in how you come out of it in a very simple terms. But well-being can be innate, and is innate, actually. It's how we view it. It's our own thought processes, letting the stresses go, breathing, bringing ourselves into the present, not feeling shame and guilt, or holding on to shame and guilt, I should say, from things that have happened years ago. If we're able to let it go, not judging everyone else by our own reactions immediately. We've all got moral compasses. I'm not saying there aren't people out there that are just, in the way that they do things are very, very different to my moral compass. That happens. I'm not saying everyone is perfect by any stretch, but sometimes we react too fast. And I think as long as we're able to live within our own moral compass, with our own innate well-being, and we're comfortable with the I am statement, you can add whatever label you want. What's the label you'd like to add to yourself? That's the bit I'd reflect on. What's the I am you want to be? I am, a wonderful parent. Well, I want to live that way. That's the person I want to be going forward. I am an athlete who competes at a high level. Well, that's the route I'm going to take. So think about the labels you want to have and let go of the ones that you don't, I think is a good starting point. But that starts with talking. For me, that's a really important element. And there's loads of other ways you can do, but talking to you, talking to my family, being vulnerable and talking, being emotional sometimes, looking at all the different spiritual bits. So I talk a lot. We've got different energy buckets. And I do a lot of the physical energy stuff. I do exercise a lot. I don't get enough sleep. That's in the physical one, but I do a lot of physical energy. But whether or not I feel the spiritual one enough that you do, I could probably do a little bit more on the spiritual side. And that can be around purpose and meaning, and not just about, meditation, but I could certainly fill that bucket a bit more. Emotional, I think I'm pretty in tune with. I'm not scared to cry in front of my family and be emotional. But there's different, and the mental is the other bucket along with physical. So I think there's things we could all do to improve and have an awareness, which links to your beat model, actually, the one we did last week.
It does. But also I'd say that, interestingly, on the spiritual one, because the examples you were giving with the I am this, I am that, and that, I remember we did this as an exercise in one of the practical philosophy courses that I did a number of years ago, which was exactly saying the same thing. It's like they were asking each person, how would you describe yourself? I'm a mother, I'm a this, I'm a that. And I think I guess had a bit of exploration in this area anyway. So I just said, I am. I didn't say anything else. I just said, I am. And he said, look, yes, absolutely. And he drew a line past the I ams, because everything was the constant. And this, I guess, what they were talking about was I guess you could call it your soul, your spirit, your constant, right? What is your essence? And the essence is the I am. And almost the fact that you're saying that and using that as an example there, and you've got,
I had no idea you'd done that, by the way, just for those listening. I had no idea you'd gone through this exercise ever.
But you're there. That could be your spiritual bucket in some way, by simply recognizing the I am. Ultimately could be the ultimate spiritual bucket, because you recognize the unchanging nature of the I am, which is the unchanging changer of who you are innate. Because at the end of the day, you are different from where you were 30 minutes ago, right? Your cells have changed. Sure. Certainly every 7 years, most cells in our body are completely revamped. But what is the one constant? And it's that, I guess, whether it's your consciousness, your soul, your spirit, whatever. So you could actually be filling your spirit bucket without realizing it by explaining that to me right now, I feel.
Yeah, well, listen, I think that's a good place to
I think
probably
so too.
almost end. I got to mention one thing. I meant to mention this at the start of the show,
Oh,
and we went
yeah.
into the trauma thing. Because I did some reflective bits on our last podcast, and there was a bit that you mentioned with two things. One thing I mentioned, I was frustrated with myself for not clarifying, and one thing you mentioned which just made me chuckle. And maybe it's a good way to lighten the mode slightly when we're talking about some quite heavy stuff during the course of the show. But I mentioned how I eat a lot of donuts, and there's no good in a donut whatsoever, and therefore I shouldn't do it. I'm going to challenge that. Of course, there's good in a donut. It's just the good is not nutritious. It's how it makes me feel when I see it and eat it. And I was too quick to tell you it was a bad thing, and that's me holding guilt and shame towards that donut, which I should not have done, because actually I love a donut and I love it for all the right reasons, which is not the nutritious ones. It's for how it makes me feel, and I enjoy eating it, and I don't mind the nutrition. I take that decision. I think you said last time on the show you make decisions to eat bread and butter. I thought, why didn't I use that opportunity to say that's why I eat donuts? So I'm going to hold myself
today.
Yeah, so there you go. I'm no longer ashamed of eating donuts.
You shouldn't be, right? It serves a purpose. It has a higher purpose of some sort.
Exactly. The bit I wanted to bring up with you that just made me laugh, okay? And you made it quite, I wrote it down. You said, I gave up alcohol for 10 years after the incident you had where you drank too much wine aged 12.
Well,
what I thought was really interesting is most people shouldn't be drinking age 12. The fact you gave up alcohol for the next 6 years where you're not even legally allowed to drink it wasn't that magnanimous of you at the time. It just made, if you listen to it back, I had this incident when I was 12. And after that, I gave up alcohol for the next 10 years. I was like, you weren't legally allowed to drink it then, Harry. It just made me laugh. But it was like, that's 10 years of my life. It the age of 22.
It's true. I did. Just to clarify, I actually only gave up wine. I gave up alcohol for 2 years.
Okay,
I gave up wine for 10. I gave up wine for 10 years, and I was having this discussion with my folks.
I think legally you can't really give it up till you're 18, though, right? And you gave it up when you were 12. It's like my 9-year-old saying, "Daddy, I've given up wine." Good for you, son.
We were given wine. And my parents were disputing this the other day at dinner until we clarified. But we were drinking wine from the age of 5. Now, granted, that was literally like a finger depth of in a small cup. But we were having wine at the table on a Sunday from that age. So by the time I was 12, I was quite used to drinking a little bit of wine. But yeah, I gave it up. And actually to this day, and talk about trauma again, but ending it on a lighter note, I still don't really like wine. When I take a sip of wine, it's somewhere in my brain, and I can almost see it sometimes, I'm flashing back to that time when I'm 12 years old at that wine festival. And that's a big part. There's a physical reaction in my body that just doesn't really like wine. So I rarely drink it.
I get it. A lot of people, I think, have got the same memory when it's absinthe or vodka or gin. We've all had that moment where we just drank a bit. It was just the fact you said I gave it up for me at 12. It just made me laugh. When I
yes, I know. But my parents are great parents, by the way. So they taught us well, because none of us ended up abusing alcohol or anything like that, or doing anything in that regard. So
they for sure. Well, they say, what is it? They learn from the past, don't live in it.
Yeah,
that's good. Yeah, I think alcohol's a good example of your one there, and other things that have gone. So
all right,
Harry, it's been good. It's been I've enjoyed it. So listen, we've carried. I'm going to have a disclaimer at the start of the show, because we're not therapists in the world of trauma, but everyone goes through it, and we thought it'd be an interesting topic to talk about. And thank you to the listener that actually brought this to the fore for me, because it sent me on a bit of a spiral journey for the last 2 weeks, examining all the mini T's in my life and how they may or may not have impacted me now. And I think that's it's been a really interesting and insightful journey for me, and it's about raising awareness. Awareness leads to insight, insight leads to action, and it's I think it's interesting.
Good. All right, well, I hope our listeners enjoy it. Share this with 1 or 2 friends that you might think might benefit, and let us know your feedback as well.
That'd be great. Fantastic. Thank you, Harry. I'll catch you again next week, buddy.
Take care, Nick.
Cool.